we go.
Hi, everybody. So today, Erika has kindly invited me to join her on her channel, and we're going to do a little video for everyone talking about past lives, which is a discussion that we got into after Erika's most recent video of the 11 paranormal questions tag, which is a pretty cool tag if you haven't checked it out. Erika should link it in the cards somewhere over there.
I don't know how to do that. I will figure that
We'll
out.
get her to do that. Don't worry. It's really easy.
Watch any of my videos, you'll see I've never done that.
Well, you're going to learn. It's going to be awesome.
Yay.
Yay. So yeah, this conversation kind of got sparked by when we were talking about how both of us have had really strong connections or reactions to historical time periods and like museums and things like that. And one of the things that came up that was pretty interesting was the period of Egypt and mummies, which Erika isn't hugely fond of, but I have always had a very strong affinity for Egyptology and Egypt and the history of Egypt and the cultural and historical perspectives of Egypt and things like that. And you know, there's a widely proposed theory that people who have strong connections to historical time periods often are probably connected to them in a reincarnation, past life kind of way. And we were watching, she sent me this really wonderful video from the University of, what was that again?
UVA, I don't know what that is. University of Virginia or
Virginia,
something?
maybe?
Yeah.
I'm sure she can put a link to it in the
that I can do. That I do know.
Yeah. And it was really interesting because it is a very scientific approach to the concept of past lives and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the scientific evidence that we have slash almost anecdotal in some regards, right? It's one of those topics that's kind of like UFOs, right? There's tons of evidence out there that there's something happening,
right?
But we have no way of like defining exactly what is occurring. So it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So if you're interested in past lives, hang out because we're going to talk about it. So Erika, it's your show.
Thank you for introducing. For some reason, I got cold feet and got nervous. Maybe in a past life, I had like some sort of public speaking problem or something.
Because it fell on stage.
Right. And I was going to say your life in Egypt was probably better than mine, as we'll discuss. I feel like any lifetime I might have had in that time period in that location was not a positive one. I just have a feeling. So your reaction to it was much better than mine. So we can start off by talking about that, since that's kind of the initial conversation that we had when we began.
Well, how did you get interested in past lives? I don't think we've actually ever talked about that.
The same question. I think when I was a child, I just always intuitively believed in reincarnation. And I remember watching a movie, and I was trying to remember the name of this movie before, and of course I forgot to look it up. It was a movie from the 90s, and it was about this couple in Hollywood that are in this really toxic relationship, and it turns out they had the same toxic relationship in the past. What's that movie called? I'll have to find out and link it. I'm trying to even remember but I watched like stuff on TV about reincarnation, basically. I will link the name of the movie because it's going to drive me insane. So I was interested in that. And I think when I was in my teens, I had like a spontaneous memory, and I was always interested in history, like passionately interested in history. And I was always interested in living history, like costumes, what people did in their daily lives, more so than like military history or political history. I just was really interested in how people lived. And I started working in museums when I was about 13 years old. I volunteered and I did tours and stuff at a local like Pioneer Village kind of situation. And I had some paranormal experiences there, not related to past lives, but so I've always had that interest in history. And me being who I am now, I realized that it was probably an interest in past lives was a big tie-in to that. The Egyptian mummy issue that I have. I have this strange phobia of Egyptian mummies. I don't remember when I first realized I had that problem. I mean, I always went to museums, so I was probably relatively young when I first, had a negative reaction to seeing Egyptian mummies. But it became clear in my teens and early 20s that it was specifically Egyptian mummies, not just any kind of mummified body. And I had increasingly bad reaction to it. It was also around the time when I had that spontaneous memory that had nothing to do with Egypt. It had to do more with, I think, like the British Isles. So something about like coming of age and like around that age of my late teens and early 20s where something happened, maybe on a spiritual level, where I started to connect more with memories of past lives. And I've been fascinated with reincarnation since then. What about you?
So my interest in past lives probably developed out of, like many of my interests, out of my mom's obsession with conspiracy television series when I was younger. And she always had the X-Files on, or some conspiracy show about something, and past lives and things. Like I still remember one of the very first memories I had about like the concept of like past lives and near death experiences was, it was something called like the weight of the soul or something. And the whole postulation theory that they were presenting is that there's this inexplicable very small amount of weight that between someone, like the moment someone's living and the moment someone's died, you actually lose like
I
a
heard about
certain amount of weight.
right, like point
No one
whatever
knows why.
whatever. Right.
Yeah, there's no, like, when people die, right, we all know that anything that you have inside of you when you are waiting to go goes. Right, gotta go potty, guess what, when you go, it goes. So it's not a very pretty thing, right? But the
Right.
moment before that happens, there's also a registerable amount of weight. And it was only in, I believe, and this is all off the top of my head from when I was like 13, everyone, so if I'm like pulling this out of my ass and you're fact checking this, don't call me out, because this is like just my memory. Okay. But they were talking about how the reason why people, or the reason why this had come up, was because more and more in modern times, right, as people are passing on operating tables actually have scales built into them, right? And they were noticing that at time of death, right, the weight, there was a noticeable but very small differentiation
Right.
amount of weight. So the whole program was based on like the weight of the soul, and these people who that like, and doctors who had noticed, like, when people passed on the table, or if they had an NDE, where, i.e., their heart stopped for an extended period of time, and then these people reported having out-of-body experiences and things like that, that weight shift would occur, and it was noticeable, and it was recorded, like in the operating room, right? So it was just really fascinating to me, and I was like, oh, that's always really interesting. And then it wasn't until I was a teenager, and we were in Denver at the Museum of Natural History, which isn't very, I mean, there's dinosaur bones and this amazing, like, it's probably my favorite thing in the whole world, because this giant exhibit of gems and crystals and minerals. I'm sure you've been there. You've been there,
I
right?
haven't been there. Strange.
What? Oh my gosh. So when you come back to Colorado, you have to go, because the whole exhibit is set up like a giant mine, and they actually have a crystal cave. Like, they disassembled a crystal. You walk into this room and you're literally inside of a geode. It's the coolest thing in the whole wide world. And they have literally every crystal you could possibly imagine. It's so cool. And if you're like a metaphysical nerd, you walk in there and it's literally like you can feel the air, like, it's so cool.
Why did I not go? I had kids, so
it's so cool. So when you come back,
okay,
you have to put that on your list. But anyways, they have that, and then they have a Native American exhibit, which is really cool. Lots of cool dinosaurs. And then they have this one little room that is like maybe the size of a 2-car garage. It's not huge, but they have a few mummies there. And if you,
I don't know if I want to go now.
And they have like some Egyptian sarcophagi and Egyptian artifacts and things that were found with these individuals. And I remembered walking into the room, and I had like these flashbacks, and it was the weirdest thing. It was like waking vivid visions, and like smells and taste. Like I could taste the air. It was just very weird. And I
Wow, that's
still
really
remember to this day, my mom looked at me. My mom had like walked off. I literally walked into the room in the doorway and stopped. And I must have stood there for 10 minutes because my mom walked around and came back and was like, "Are you okay? You're white as a ghost."
wow.
And I didn't really think about it much because I was like 14 or 15. And that was when I very first started beginning my exploration of my spiritual path. I was very fortunate to have parents who were very supportive in the fact that I went through. One of my mom's favorite stories to tell is when I asked if I could go to Catholic church with my best friends from like elementary school, and I came back and I was like, "Mom, it was like a cult." And my mom was like, "Uh-huh."
I actually did the same thing. I went to Catholic church with my I don't remember feeling that way, but I felt that way about other Christian churches.
Yeah. I was like, it was very strange, and I was very young and didn't understand, right? And she's like, "Well, everybody's different and everything's different." But when I stumbled into, I think it was a Barnes and Noble back when Barnes and Nobles were in malls, and I stumbled into the New Age section, and then I saw this book about witchcraft, and I was like, "What? It's a real thing?" Right?
That's so cool.
And then it wasn't until a couple of years later that I started reading books on spirituality and Buddhism, because that had struck my interest early in high school, that I started reading about reincarnation. And I was like, "Oh, this is really interesting." And as I started thinking about it, there was a lot of discussions of connections to the past, right? People who are enamored with certain periods of history. And there's two specific periods of history that I've always been obsessed with in an unhealthy way. One is Egyptian history. When I had the opportunity to live in Europe for a year, which was amazing. I lived in London, and then I took basically an entire month at the end of my stay over there, and I backpacked through Europe on my own, alone. Wow. Which was an adventure. And I still remember when I went to the Louvre, and I had that same like experience when I was walking through the Egyptian exhibit there, except it was worse. I actually had to sit down for about 20 minutes because I got like so disembodied, I guess is the best way to explain it. Like I just literally felt like someone punched me in the gut, and I couldn't breathe. Yeah, and it was very strange. And it's interesting because at that time I had, again, during that period of my life, I kind of walked away. That was during my break from tarot. It was during my break from spirituality. Like I was super focused on school and like I have to buy a house and I need to be what society tells me to be. And I don't know, I kind of lost my way. But I still remember having that connection. And the other thing that's always struck me is I've always been obsessed with the Renaissance period. Like you, I worked at the Renaissance Festival here in Colorado for 9 years. I've gone pretty much every year of my life, except for a handful when I was not living in the state, since I was like 9.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been around for forever. But I've always been obsessed with Renaissance art history, with Renaissance history, especially the Tudor period of Henry VIII, and the Elizabethan age and Shakespearean history. I've been obsessed with Shakespearean history. In fact, Shakespeare prompted my interest in theater, where usually it's the other way around. People who get into theater get interested in Shakespeare. And for me, it was the opposite, because I don't think I ever would have gone into theater, as like my interest in theater, if it wasn't for in high school, when the high school drama teacher decided to do Othello as the first play that I could audition for my freshman year. And I read Othello. We read Othello in the English class because the English teacher and the drama teacher were like bestie friends outside of work. So the English teacher always taught what the drama teacher was presenting, which was really cool. But we had to read Othello, and I like became obsessed with, because I was like, holy crap, this is amazing. And that led to my, obsession with Renaissance history and things like that.
I love Shakespeare. Yeah, I can relate to that.
Yeah, and my most sort of recent, like, feelings of connection have been surrounding, and I've talked a little bit to some other people about this, like Lisa from Supportive Tarot with Lisa and Danny from Danny Mystic, is there's this whole idea that Edward de Vere, who is one of the old Earls of Oxford, is actually the writer of William Shakespeare. And I'm like, I'm obsessed right now with it. And because it feels very familiar. And I remember when I first clapped eyes on Edward de Vere's portrait, I was like, whoa. It was like this uncanny familiarity. And it's like, it's kind of like those instances when you're walking through the grocery store and you look at someone and you're like, I know you. I don't know how I know you, but I know you. Right.
Feeling. Yeah.
And so I've always just had these weird connections with history and with people in history and time periods and things like that. And that led to then, around in high school, to my interest in past lives. And so I got books about it. I've never been one to do a ton of past life work, as in like tons of meditation and going to mediums and things like that. I've never felt,
It's a little scary.
Yeah, I've just never felt the need to.
Okay.
It's like, or I already know. Like, you're going to tell me something I already know, and I really don't need you to confirm it for me. Like, I just know.
Right. I get that.
Yeah, and it's like, it's one of those things too where, I have dreams about those time periods, and it's, part of me being the skeptic that I am about a lot of things, right, is like, oh, well, you have dreams about that because you read books about it all the time and you're looking at paintings all the time.
Right.
But then, like, I have these instances where I smell things that I've never smelled before in these dreams, or it's like very specific imagery of like locations, and then I'll be reading a book that has a picture of that location, and I've never seen that place before, but I saw it in a dream, right? And it's like, well, how the hell did I know what that looked like? That's kind of weird. And I've had several of those experiences in my life where I've looked at artworks or photographs of ancient places, and I'm like, whoa, I had a dream about that like last year. And it creeps me out. It's super creepy. So I don't know, that's kind of my foray, I can't even talk today. Foray into past lives.
You weren't French. Is that a French word? So what I want to know is if the soul weighs more than a feather, because then we're all screwed.
I have no idea. I just remember it being
from
like
that Egyptian perspective. We're all.
I know. I just remember that documentary talking about, and I don't know why. Like, how when you have memories about things as a kid, that one stands out so much in my mind. And I just remember that it was like a very small amount, but it was enough to be measurable, but enough to be debatable.
Part of me wants to like Google it and find out what the number was, and then find out what a feather weighs.
Yeah,
because it depends on the feather, though, right? Like,
right, yeah,
ostrich feather. Yeah. Then maybe we have a fighting chance. But that's all fascinating, and I also have time periods that I have a real affinity to. The Egyptian thing is weird because it's like a phobia, but obviously also it's like fascinating at the same time. It's and I definitely feel a connection to like the pre-Christian time period in like Scotland, Ireland, and England, like Druidic kind of. I've been fascinated with watching. There was one show. Again, I'm not remembering anything today because I have a mom brain. Recently, I saw. I think it was on Prime, where it was about the invasions, the Roman invasions into England, and about the Druids. Oh, I wish I remembered. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'll have to.
There's tons of those.
Right, there are, and I've watched.
Do you watch Time Team?
Maybe.
That's like the archaeological one where they go through England and they dig things.
This was like a actual, like fiction kind of show. But I've also always been interested in the 18th century. I really focused I did a degree in history, and I really focused a lot of my studies on the 18th century. In this country, in America. I'm originally from Canada. So I have the same thing where I have certain time periods that I'm fascinated with. Like the turn of the 20th century, that time period too, always fascinated me. And when I did do a video with Drew, She Who Walks Between the Worlds, we both did the same past life regression and kind of reported back on our experiences. And the life that I experienced was a lifetime where I would have been alive from around the 1860s to like the 1920s, 1930s. So that was interesting because that explained a lot for me. A lot of the museums I worked in Canada, because Canada's a little bit of a, I guess, younger country in a sense, not really, but in a lot of ways it is than the US. So a lot of the museums, like the living history museums and stuff, are from that Victorian kind of time period. So yeah, I definitely can relate to, but the Egyptian mummy thing is interesting. And I think, did I talk about it in that paranormal video? Did I talk about the Egyptian thing? Because I remember
I don't remember now. We glided so much about it. It's all kind of like one big memory.
Right. Well, that's okay. You're allowed to not remember, because I apparently can't remember any movie or TV show I've ever watched ever. It's mom brain. It's a thing. But I told you about how when I was a teenager, I went to a museum and I saw an Egyptian mummy and I fainted. And
yes.
This happened like 3 or 4 times. And some of it was my friends, like I told them the story about me fainting, and they thought it would be funny to take me to like a different exhibit at the museum and not tell me there were Egyptian mummies in a certain spot, and then I passed out again. And I remember like the cold marble against my face and the museum security guard standing over me and looking perplexed. And I tried to overcome that phobia on my own. Like I would go to the museum by myself and I would try to go, and I'm getting sweaty palms just thinking about it. I would try to go into the Egyptian wing and I would try to look at the mummy, and there'd be a little boy like tapping on the glass, you know, with his face right up to the mummy, and I'm like standing there. I literally dug my nails into my hands so bad that I like made my hands bleed. So I had this reaction where I would pass out when I saw them. And it happened, 3 times that I can remember distinctly. The first time when I was like with my family and I was there, and then the time my friends did it where I really like passed out on the floor. And then another time I was there. And I've also had that kind of hyperventilating kind of, it's almost like people with fear of heights, where if they get up like really high, they have this like panic attack kind of feeling. But it was only with Egyptian mummies. Like when I did my university degree, I did courses on ancient history, and I had to read the chapter on the mummies, and I had to like literally put Post-it notes over every picture because I would get like so stressed out. So it's weird. And like I remember when I did that regression with Drew, there basically you're in this temple and there's this long hallway and there are all these doors like going, you know, indefinitely forever. And they said, the person who was doing the regression said, either you'll just see the same type of door with a number on it and pick a number and go to the door you feel drawn to, or you'll see doors that look different. And I saw doors that all look different. Like they all look from different time periods. Some of them actually look like they were from the future, which was really interesting. And I saw one that looked like Egyptian kind of sandstone pillars with like, you know, the hieroglyphs on them. And then it had like, not bamboo, but some sort of woven kind of curtain. There wasn't like a door. And I remember looking at that one and going, oh, hell no, I'm not going in there. So I'm pretty sure I had a past life there, and I don't think it ended well.
It was a bad one.
Wasn't.
Probably.
I should probably go and face up to it, but it's scary. Like
interesting, yeah.
The other spontaneous memory I had, and I'm sure I talked about this in the video with Drew, where I was, you know, that kind of liminal state when you're between like waking and sleeping. Mm-hmm. That's a really powerful state for me, and I have a lot of creativity and like psychic things happen during that time. It was during that time, and I just had this like dream that the weird thing about the dream is usually when I'm dreaming, I'm me, like I'm me who I am now. And in this dream, I was me, but I looked different. I had like my skin looked different. My body felt different. I had this long red hair, and I was in this like wooden kind of cage. Like it was, you know how they used to have those like small trees that they would kind of sharpen at the top, and they would bury, you know, they would use it.
Yeah.
I was in some enclosure that was made up of that kind of thing with all sorts of pokey, like sharp, and it was under this big tree. It was summertime, and I looked down and I saw this long red hair, and I was wearing like really tattered rags to the point where I couldn't tell you what time period at all. I have no idea. It doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, Britain, but it felt like it was because my skin was pale. I had red hair, and I had I feel like I was taller, which is kind of weird because you think people were shorter, but that's, I think, a myth, right? People weren't necessarily shorter. And I had really, really pale skin, and I was covered with mud. And I remember thinking, I hope he comes to rescue me, but I had this really bad feeling that he wasn't going to rescue me. And then I was out of it, and I was like, oh crap. So I always kind of wondered if it was like I was executed, you know, for witchcraft, because I'd always been interested in witchcraft. Ooh, I just bumped my table. So when I talked to some witchy friends years later, they said, oh, you know, like I was dunked in the stool. I've had a few people tell me that they were drowned. And they said, you know, we actually, one person said to me, I actually think it's not kind of, I said, oh, this is probably a cliche. She's like, I don't think so. I think like there's a reason why you're called and you're interested in this spiritual path now. You know, there's a lot about the history that I could kind of unpack around that. So I kind of took it with a grain of salt, but I definitely had that experience too. So those are kind of the only experiences I've had where I've actually had like a you know, memory, or I've done the regression. I would like to do more of it, but I definitely have the same sense that you have of like working in museums and stuff. I would just feel familiar. It would feel
It's
familiar.
like deja vu when you go there.
Yeah, exactly. There was one museum I worked in where I was sitting in a room and it was really quiet. It was like a bad weather day. There weren't a lot of visitors, and I was sitting there and I just kind of like for a second I felt like I lost myself, and I just felt like I was in that time period, and it felt really familiar, and then I was like back again, you know. Or I'll have like the visceral thing where you mentioned smells and stuff. I put you know, those Ugg boots that have the fur lining, I put those on without socks on once, and I had this really weird like feeling, that memory of like hunting with like moccasins or something. It was really weird. Like it was the feeling of the foot with the bare foot in that kind of shoe.
Yeah, feelings and foods. I've had some strange memories like that, especially when I was going across Europe, when I was trying like different foods and things like that, which was really interesting. Where it's like, I know I've never eaten this before, but this is really familiar to me. You know, it's so interesting too, like how things lead you to different sorts of the interesting thing that I'm like kind of unraveling right now, and I don't know how connected I am or not, but this whole idea of Edward de Vere being the original author of Shakespeare has always been super fascinating. And the whole concept of Shakespeare not having written Shakespeare, the man that we know as William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, who was the son of a glove maker and, you know, dealt in wool and grain. And literally we have 6 signatures of his, which are all different. They're all terrible. They look like someone who doesn't know how to write. Like there's just tons of evidence that point to the fact that the dude that we know from Stratford didn't write the freaking place. There's no way. There's no evidence of him. We do know that he became an actor and he was a part of an acting company. We don't know how good he was or if he took lead roles. We know we have no documentation of him ever leaving the south of England, let alone going to Europe or Italy, which the majority, well, not the majority, but a good portion of Shakespeare's plays are set in, right? So there's all these interesting
Hamlet,
he didn't even leave a Bible. Like the man didn't leave a single written piece of evidence anywhere in history, and he's considered the most prolific writer of humankind, but we have nothing that shows that, right? So
what about the portrait? Was the portrait like maybe not him then?
The engraving in the first folio, is that the one that you're talking about, the black and white engraving?
I suppose so. I know there's like,
so there's a painting portrait that we have of him that we think is of him.
Right, that's my question.
Then there's the engraving in the first folio, which is actually it's encoded. If you look at the engraving very closely, you'll see that there's a line that goes down his chin like a mask. His head actually is floating higher than what you would have for a neck. The shoulder that is on the right side of the picture is actually his left shoulder. It's the back of his shoulder, so it's reversed. There's a lot of really interesting things about that engraving that are just super weird.
Wow.
But like I've always been interested in it as a topic, right? And fascinated by like the theory that there's like that Bacon wrote that stuff. There's all kinds of theories
Yeah.
who wrote it. And
Right.
the latest one, the latest and most accepted one, I think, is the Edward de Vere theory.
Okay.
And there's a lot of like encoded messages within the first folio, which is the very first printing of his collected works, as well as the first printing of the sonnets, which are the love poems that he wrote to some lady and a guy, right?
I had a copy.
Whoever this person was.
Right.
Interestingly enough, the person that is being attributed to all of the encoding of this stuff is John Dee. John Dee was Queen Elizabeth's court sort of magus, right? Yeah. And his interests are very similar to mine, which is very strange because he didn't walk a singular path, right? He was very interested in everything, right? Like astrology and ancient magic and like Solomon's magic and like, esotericism and all of those. And part of that is because, of course, back then you kind of had to worry about this thing being a heretic because they kind of killed you if that was the case, right? But at the same time, it was really interesting. And it's so fascinating because I've just begun to dive into John Dee, and I've always known who John Dee is and but not like a very in-depth exploration of who he was and his interests. So, but it's interesting like how you find those connections and through lines to people in history. And
puzzle pieces, yeah,
and for me it's always been, it's like it's more of a connection. It's almost like looking through a family photo album, which is very interesting to me, and I don't know why I get that feeling, right?
Oh, I know.
And one of the things that has always fascinated me about the idea of past lives is how we carry those memories through to other lives and how past life souls usually connect, right? People have always told me, even when I was a kid, that he's an old soul, right? Like, right, you're an old soul, right? Oh, look at you, you're an old, and like and that tends to be the case, it seems like, with a lot of people who are interested in the occult these days. I've never been or had issues with death. In fact, it incredibly bothered my father when my grandfather, his father, passed away, who I was incredibly close with. The man pretty much raised me because both of my parents were self-employed. So if I wasn't at home, I was over at my grandfather's house. And he was retired from the military and my grandmother worked. So it's pretty much me and him a lot of the time growing up. And when he passed, I didn't really grieve. I was like, yeah, he's gone. It's fine. He's still around. Like, and people got upset with me, right? But I've never been afraid of death. I've never had, even when my grandmother who passed of breast cancer, I like miss them, but I know that they're not like gone forever, I guess.
Right.
And it's interesting because in that documentary, or that talk that you sent me, that video of that talk at the university, they were talking about how there is a distinct correlation between people who have near-death experiences and a fear of death. They tend to be people who lose interest in materialism. They tend to be people who
no longer fear death.
Right. They
spiritual.
They become much more spiritual and things like that. And even as a kid, right, like I just never had issues with relatives passing away, close friends of the family passing away. It never fazed me. And a lot of my family and friends are like, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, well, first of all, and it wasn't until my grandfather passed away that I remember my mom and my dad was mad. And he was like, I don't understand what's wrong with you. You're upped in the head, right? And I was like, well, first of all, I can't control it. There's no reason for me to become emotional over something I can't control. Second of all, I know he's still around. Like, so his meat bag form isn't here anymore, but like he's still a part of my life. And he's in a better place. He was in pain. He had a lot of health issues in his old age. And I was like, why would I be so greedy as to expect him to stick around in a terrible state when he could be someplace much better, right? And it was at that moment, and I still remember, and this person is now gone. His name was Uncle Bud. He he was there for this discussion, and he was like, "You were such an old soul." And this guy was not like, he was a tattoo artist, he was a biker guy. and I remember him saying that, and I was like, and it was kind of like one of those aha moments where it's like, well, that kind of makes sense. Like, if I've been through this game a few times and I kind of just know, like, this is what it's about, and yeah, it sucks, but you know, you have to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a part of my, you know, incarnation cycle that that is a lesson that I've learned and mastered, right? This life is about something else, right? This life is about you figuring some other piece of your shit out, right? And it's things, and it's moments and things and concepts like that that have always fascinated me when it came to the idea of reincarnation and past lives, right?
Yeah.
I've also always been obsessed with the Titanic, interestingly enough.
Me too, actually.
Yeah, I did the Titanic exhibit in Las Vegas, where there's actually a piece of the ship.
Right.
And that is the first time I ever had an emotional reaction in a public place. I'm not an emotional in public person. I just don't do it.
Right.
I don't know why. I've never really done the shadow work on that. Part of it is just because I think I know how to control my emotions really well.
Mm-hmm.
But I had like a legit emotional breakdown, and I just started crying uncontrollably, because the cool thing is you can touch the boat at the very end. So the exhibit is really well designed. It's really cool. When you get there, you get a little sheet of paper that is a ticket.
Yeah.
And it has a name of a passenger on it. And you go through the exhibit, and there's it starts with like the building of the ship and it leaving, and the exhibit is laid out like the timeline of the Titanic, basically.
Right.
And you go through the different classes. They actually have like an iceberg that they keep with it, so you can like touch the iceberg and feel how cold the water was that night. It's really cool. They have this really cool reconstruction of the deck that night. They use mirrors to give it the appearance of the length that it was. So you can, and they have like, it's environmentally controlled, so you can feel the wind, and they have like water mist. It's really, really crazy. But I still remember at the very end, you walk into this big room that looks like a giant sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Warehouse. It's like a big open room, and they have a piece of the hull that they brought up hanging there, and you could touch it. And I touched it, and it wasn't like sobbing, like like movie sobbing. My eyes just started crying, and I didn't know why. It was the weirdest thing. And I like, all the hairs on my body stood up. It was just one of those like really surreal moments. And then I looked at, and the last thing you do is there's a big wall that you can go up to, and there's a guy standing there, and he takes your ticket, and then he tells you where you are on the wall and if you lived or died.
Wow. Ooh.
Which was, and the ticket that I got, the person lived. But it was such a weird thing, because I am not an emotional, like I don't cry in movie theaters very often. Like I've had, I get teared up, but I don't like have an emotional thing. And and I was with people from work, which was the weirdest thing. Like, like, and here I am just like, and I'm like, I'm a big guy. I'm like, big 6 foot, almost 4 guy, like just tears just streaming down my face. I was pale as a ghost. And everyone was like, are you okay? Are you okay? And I was like, I don't know what's going on. I'm just having a moment.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know
so strange.
I actually know I wasn't on the Titanic, because I had that lifetime that I did the regression. I would have been alive during that time period, and I would have been in England. So I know I wasn't, but I was alive in that time period. So it makes sense that I would feel some sort of connection to that. But that is like, clearly there's like a clairsentient kind of thing. I learned that that's the clair, that's when you feel things, because I have that.
I mean, I've always been a very touch empathic thing. It's something I've talked about on my channel before, is like, I have to be very careful when I go into like antique stores and stuff when I touch things, because I will feel other people's emotions. And And I think that actually comes into play with my ability to control my emotions, because for the longest time I've always had that issue of like going into public and feeling other people's emotions. I was a very emotional child in public. I was a very I think I just literally had a little mini stroke. I was a very emotional child in public. And
that's
my
interesting.
mom told me stories of me like having emotional breakdowns and flipping out, mad, and I wonder how much of that is attributed to my empathic abilities, because I didn't really learn about being an empath until I was in very near the end of my college career, when I met an older woman who was like, "Oh wow, you're a massive empath," and I was like, "I'm a what?" What does that even mean? And she talked to me about it, and I was like, whoa, yeah, that's whoa, you know. It was one of those very light bulb moments in life.
Right. And it sounds like the combination of like the past life piece would almost amplify that, because you probably felt that same feeling of kind of familiarity and like you've been there kind of feeling when you went through that exhibit, but combining that with that ability, because you're probably also feeling the energy of everybody else who is on that ship too. So it's like it would be a really intense experience, and that would result in you having that emotional reaction.
It was very strange. Even when I still remember when I went to see Titanic with my grandmother, and she was like sobbing, and I remember I got really cold, and I felt just like I wanted to vomit all over the place.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that there's a commonality of like that kind of visceral, like the reaction I had to the Egyptian mummy stuff was very, very visceral. And I kind of have the same reaction anytime I watch a movie, especially historical movies where people were executed. Like I cannot deal. Like I've seen all sorts of other violent stuff where people get killed and, you know, everything. But
anything about Anne Boleyn basically and her getting her head chopped off.
Like that, like I get upset like more than I should kind of thing. Whereas I'll watch like a scene with a battle where people are getting decapitated and be like, okay, that was gross. I don't need to see that violence.
No problem with 300.
Oh, exactly. But if somebody's like being led to like a pyre or something, I freak out. Like I can't deal.
Did you watch Game of Thrones?
No, I probably couldn't. Vikings freaked me out too. Like there was that one execution in Vikings. Like I didn't even watch it. What did you call it? The eagle thing with the lungs and no.
I haven't watched. I'm a terrible person. I have not watched Vikings yet.
Doesn't make you
on my list, and I will get there.
You're fine.
I want to watch it. It's not like I just literally haven't. I haven't had time.
I remember I also told you a story where I was in, did a degree in history, and I was in a class, and this professor who taught like colonial American history, was it colonial American? No, it was a different professor. He was teaching about the Renaissance kind of medieval time period. And he did this almost like what you would call like a guided meditation, where he described what it would be like to be in like a medieval city. Like he described what you would see, what would you smell, and he just like sucked me right into that. And I was like, this is like way too familiar. Like I got really not emotional, but I just felt really drained, and I felt like I experienced it on a deep level. And part of me like thinks, okay, I'm really good at like, you know, guided meditations, active imagination stuff, astral travel. So it could be that, but it could also be, sometimes it's hard to figure out whether it's that stuff going on or it's past life stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Part of the deciding factor for me is that sense of you've been there before, that familiar feeling that you've been there,
it's that weird deja vu. It's that Matrix feeling of like, wait.
Like there's a glitch and you're back there.
Yep.
Exactly. And the Egyptian thing, I don't think I've let myself feel that, because I think I'm just so freaked out about it. And I want to do that meditation again, because I want to try to go in with the intention of experiencing that lifetime where I had the red hair, but I'm also scared. I'm scared of the Egyptian one too. And it's interesting because when I initially did the regression, you're supposed to go in with the intention of connecting with a lifetime that has a lesson for you right now. So the lifetime when I was, you know, in England in like the late 19th century was actually kind of like a boring, uneventful life, but there was a lesson there for me in terms of relationships and stuff. but it wasn't like remarkable. If anything, it was kind of depressing and uneventful. So like, and it was kind of a good one to start with, in the sense that the death part wasn't like, I think
Dramatic.
it wasn't traumatic, and you don't feel what it feels like. At least I didn't feel what it feels like to actually die. Like, I was old and I was in a wheelchair, and then I was like out of my body, and the husband I'd had in that lifetime was there, and he was young and I was young, you know, like, so it was more like that. It wasn't like somebody like tying me, you know, up to a pyre and setting me on fire. Because I've read accounts of other people doing those regressions and their experience, and they kind of account for the same kind of idea, that you don't actually physically feel what it feels like to be burnt at the stake or something, but you're definitely like experiencing everything leading up to that, you know. So I'm like,
is that guided meditation, was that like a YouTube video or like
it's on YouTube. It's linked in my video with Drew.
Oh, that's right, I saw that. Yeah,
There's
we should
one,
link it in this one too.
right, we could, if I hope I remember. There's another one by Brian Weiss, I think his name is, and he is one of the like top people in the field of past life, like regression, and like he's written books, and he's recorded like thousands of people's regressions, and they're really fascinating. I've read some of his books. I think he's written a couple. There's a meditation by him, and then there's a meditation by this other person who I found, and it was really effective. I know a couple people tried it, they didn't get results, but most people I know in our community, in the tarot and, you know, witchy pagan kind of community, have tried it. They've had really good results with it. So I do recommend it, and you don't have to pay $200 an hour for some special. My husband did that. He went to Salem on the way from Vermont here to Boston to go on a business trip. He stopped in Salem, and he paid like a couple $100 for a regression, and he didn't get anything. He was there for several hours, and he didn't have, I think some people like maybe block, you know, something's going on where they just can't connect with that, but he couldn't. So I mean, I said to him, next time you want to try it, just do this, because it's free.
Yeah. It was really interesting. The one thing I loved about that video you sent me was the discussion about children. Yeah. And the story that stands out in my mind is that the story about the kid who was a reincarnation of a World War II pilot.
James 3, they call him.
Yeah, and it was just it's those kind of stories that really stick out in my mind, of like really fascinating. Before we started recording this, we were talking about this woman who's known as Seti, who was born in the 1900s. Her original name,
is that her? That's like an Egyptian name then?
That was her, like yeah, her.
I don't want to ruin the. I'll let you talk.
Of the person that she was reincarnated from. Her given name was Dorothy Louise Eddy, and she was born in 1904. And she basically, to make the story short, so Erika doesn't have to listen to the whole thing over again.
No, it's fascinating. I love
basically, she was working with Egyptologists, doing excavations in Egypt, and she basically was like, hey, you guys, I'm a reincarnation of an Egyptian priestess, and you all need to go dig over here, and this is what you're going to find. You're going to find this tomb, and it's going to look like this, and this is what's going to be on the walls, and there's going to be 4 pillars, and there's going to be a sarcophagus in the middle, and you'd have to go down this many stairs. And I mean, it was detailed. It was so detailed that it there's no remote possibility of it being coincidental. There's no way, right?
Like that little boy, he's like, that's where my plane crashed, and he pointed
right there.
And it was exactly where there was a battle.
And it's instances like that make you think, that make you really think about it, right? Of like, well, there's got to be something to this. And I love the idea of, I love their discussion in that video of how children are much more perceptive, and there's an exceedingly larger amount of reported past life experiences from children. And I also really loved that they were talking about the data of it of it being universal across the world in all cultures, right? And that they looked at it across all cultures that believe in reincarnation, right? And when you look at like Hinduism and Buddhism and Eastern philosophies, a lot of those philosophies believe in reincarnation and the idea that your soul goes through many lifetimes in order to learn all the stuff, and then you ascend to a higher state of existence, right?
Right.
Whereas more Western traditions, you know, you go to heaven or hell, and if you're Catholic, then you hang out in purgatory for a long time until you figure your own shit, right?
No, thank you.
Right. So, and it's interesting that there is just as much, if not more, evidence for reincarnation coming out of Western cultures in situations and families that are incredibly non-believers up until the experience that they have with their child or something that triggers them, that they're like, this is no way, and in no way, shape, or form part of what I believe in, until my kids started talking about this past life, and then we like found documented evidence and stuff like that, which is and that is always the really interesting. I love it when, and it's something that's occurring more and more and more as you look at past life research and things like that, is as the world gets older and as more children that are being born, you know, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago now, right? Those are people who could potentially have had past lives, you know, in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s even, right? And those are the times when documentation got even better, right? Record keeping better. And we have evidence of these people that these other people are talking about, that there's no flipping way that they would have ever known about random dude in World War II who was flying through the skies, who got in a dogfight and crashed his plane and died, right? There's no way that kid knew about that.
Right. And
documented evidence of them.
Right. That's why the Egyptian one's so interesting, because that would have been a hard one to prove in terms of historical record, but because she knew the layout of the tomb and she knew details like that, to me it proves it. I mean, so for me, it was interesting that the regression I had happened to be in the modern era, because that's exactly, and I talked about this in the video with Drew, I did the research and I went back, having a degree in history helped me. I went back and I found the person, and I legitimately found there were two women with the first name Beatrice with a surname that started with a letter M who got married in the church, because I found the church. And like you, I had a deja vu, like when I found a church with the same name that was built around, you know, I don't know, 20 years before my experience there. And then when I saw the picture of the church, it was exactly what I saw in my regression. And I was able to find the marriage records. And there was a woman, her name was Beatrice. Her last name started, I think it was her maiden name started with M. And in my regression, I was 23 years old. She got married when she was 23 in that church. The next person named Beatrice who got married in that church wasn't until the 1940s.
Yeah.
So without a doubt, like, what are the odds of that I went into the astral realm and I picked this little thread, and I happened to pick a thread of somebody who I could actually find historical evidence. So some of this stuff I was off a little bit, like I was off by, I think, 3 years in terms of the actual date of when it happened. I said it was like 1880 and it was 1883 or something, but it was pretty bang on.
Pretty dang close.
Yeah.
Close
So, you know, it's great when you're able to be able to prove it. And I think that's a lot of the research that these people are doing at the UVA, whatever university that is. I find it fascinating. I mean, and I do think it's interesting that with the world wars happening, like the First World War and the Second World War, because I have an affinity with the 1940s too, and I keep thinking, well, where's the math on that? Like, so if I was that woman and I died in 1920, if I reincarnated shortly thereafter, I would have been a teenager in the 1940s. So I could have been a young male who died in the war or something, you know, because of the wars. You're right. It's interesting. You'll have more and more people maybe reincarnating from modern time where we can actually track it. Because, you know, if I was living in like Scotland in like, you know, pre-Roman times and I was like executed or whatever, there's no way to prove, you know, there's no way to, it has to be modern history. And even then it can be really hard the further back you go. Like, you know, the late 19th century wasn't so hard, but like if it was the 18th century, it would have been harder. You still
Yeah.
could probably find records. Like, I'm pretty sure that I'm connected to the Civil War, the American Civil War in the 18th century. But who knows if I would have to do a regression and see if I could actually find the person. You might.
Yeah. It's really interesting because there is actually a collection of people who claim to be reincarnated passengers of the Titanic. I don't know if you know this. They have like a little club, like the whole 9 yards, and it's really fascinating.
You should be part of the club.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things, right? Like everything with a grain of salt. There's probably people there who are just obsessed with the Titanic, and that's fine, right? Like whatever.
Sure.
But there's probably some really genuine, interesting stories in that group of people.
Okay.
I know that there was a documentary done about it, like back in the 90s when James Cameron's film came out, and I remember watching it and being like, oh, that's really interesting. But again, back then was when I kind of leaned away from my spiritual path. But stuff like that, like the connections of being able to like very succinctly tie those together. And it's interesting because like for me, like your story is really cool, but so many skeptics out there could just say, oh, well, you went and found this person and then you told that you had this experience. Right.
Which I don't care because I know what happened, but whatever. Yeah, you're
right. Yeah, exactly. But like the thing with the kid is like what I would then give them as evidence. Like, okay, well, how do you explain this? There's no way that this kid knew about this island and this location of this dogfight. There's no way that he knew about the planes and the markings on the planes.
So much stuff.
The name of this guy. Like, there's too many. There's too many connections there, right? For it to be coincidence of this kid just happening to stumble into his grandfather's library and finding a book and reading about this World War II
and
pilot.
I think the woman who was the sister of the person so the James that lived during the Second World War, who was a pilot, his sister was still alive in the like 90s or whenever they did this documentary or they did the research. And the child who was the reincarnation met the sister and she was really skeptical, but then she had like a 10-minute conversation with him and she's like, I totally believe it. Because he knew like the names of people who were in his unit. He knew the names of people in the family. Like, he just knew too much stuff. It was amazing. So I don't think I told you the story about my daughter. Did I tell you the story about my daughter? So she's 4 now. So when she was about 2, she started doing these little dances and chants, and it sounded a lot like Maori from New Zealand, Maori chanting, and she'd like stick her tongue out and stuff. And I'm like, I had a teacher when I was in grade school who was from New Zealand, and we did this our class did a little like, learning about another country. We did the little dance. She taught. So I'm relatively familiar with this. So I'm like, it looks like she's doing, and she called it yakitori. That's what she called it. I don't know where she got that word.
Yakitori is delicious.
She chant and so one day I come home and I bought her this little like bikini and it had like a little skirt bottom. She goes, that's the yakitori skirt. So she puts only the bottom skirt on and she starts like, she even would like grab something that looked like a spear and she'd start. So I said to my husband, watch this. I went on YouTube and I pulled up a video of Maori warriors doing like a war dance. And she went, that's it. And she started dancing along with it. And we both kind of look at each other like, okay, that's really weird. And she's grown out of it. Like, she doesn't do that anymore. And my son, who's like, 4 years older than her, was terrified of this video because they make those really scary expressions.
Yeah.
And my daughter's like, this is awesome. Like, she's just like little 2-year-old dancing along with them. And we're both kind of like, she was a Maori warrior.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me. I mean, children, there's evidence like just in like the greater umbrella paranormal world of children always being much more open and susceptible to things like that, and it's just always fascinating to me to hear stories like that because it's true, right? Like we're programmed and we are self-domesticated, right? Like we are animals and we self-domesticate ourselves. We pick traits and social things in order to be sociable, to exist in large groups and packs, and it's fascinating when you look at it from that perspective of the sheer volume of evidence that exists, especially from children's standpoint, and modern science just goes, oh, that's just children's imaginations,
right? It's just like they would say it was me trying to scam people.
And it's legitimately, and that is like my fundamental issue with modern science. Like, it's interesting, right? Because in the Renaissance, we had this revival, right? The Enlightenment of looking at old ancient traditions, Hermetic wisdom. That was a huge thing, right? And
We're there, so
yeah, both of those
Yeah,
time periods, both
yeah,
in the Renaissance and the
yeah,
Enlightenment,
for
right,
sure.
all of this came out again, right?
Right.
And
Totally.
we've always had this thing through history where spirituality and religion come together, and then they divide very dramatically, and then they come back together, and then they divide, and then they come back. And I think right now we're in one of those, like, it's coming back together
I
moments, which is
totally
really
agree.
fascinating.
I totally agree.
But
That's yeah.
it's so frustrating to me when scientists say things like when they're very dismissive in that manner, and they say things like, oh, well, that's just a child's overactive imagination, right?
Right.
And anytime I've encountered someone, even if they're not a scientist, but someone who reacts in that way, and I'm like, well, if you're a firm believer in the scientific method, right, the anecdotal evidence that exists there should make you question it, should make you form a hypothesis, and it should make you want to investigate it further. Being a good scientist isn't about dismissing things that you don't
Right.
believe. If you are observing something, right, that you don't understand, as a scientist, it should be your goal to then develop a hypothesis and find a way to test it to see if you can make it occur multiple times in order to prove that it is or is not a thing, right? Not being like, oh, well, that's not real because of X, Y, and Z, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah, I agree. And like the nice thing about that video that we watched with the UVM panel of paranormal psychologist people is they were like legit hardcore scientists. I mean, you can tell I'm talking about
PhD level.
They were and they were looking at it through that lens. It was fabulous. I love that. I mean, I'm definitely gonna do like another one of these regressions for sure, and I'll share whatever experience I find on YouTube. I talked briefly with like Drew, She Who Walks Between the Worlds, and Lady Lucy, Dana, and Trish Beanbag Hagwag. They're all good friends of mine who are on YouTube. We talked about doing like all of us who feel like we've had past lives related to possibly, being persecuted as a witch or actually being a witch in another lifetime, talked about doing meditation with the intention of finding out about that lifetime. So that's something interesting that maybe people, might, if other people in the community might want to do a VR or try to do that. And I can read that. I recommend that meditation, but if there's another one other people enjoy. I mean, I really relate to a lot of what you're saying. I was always fascinated in Nostradamus. I watched a movie about him when I
love him.
I loved him, and I was but I was like obsessed. Like I read through some of his original, so I can totally relate to the like fascination with the occult, like in previous time periods. And I do agree that science and spirituality need to come together to look at some of this stuff. So that video that I sent you, like I was really excited about watching.
I mean, fundamentally, they're both trying to answer the same question, right?
Right.
Just different approaches. And that's the thing that anytime I present it that way to anyone who's highly skeptical, right? I mean, I live in a pretty conservative area, and I encounter a lot of people who are like, oh, you're very spiritual, I see. You don't really believe in X, do you? And my answer is always, okay, well, are you like agnostic, atheist? And I get a lot of people are like, I just believe in science and evidence and things that I could see with my own eye.
Right.
And I'm like, well, they're both trying to answer the same questions, right? Like why do we have to have this divide of like, and that is the cool thing that I think we're beginning to see is scientists being more open. I mean, look at all the stuff that's going on with ufology right now, and the government not only acknowledging that they've been researching UFOs forever, right? They're saying, oh, well, that program closed. Well, you said that about Blue Book, and then this whole ATIP thing happened, and then y'all are researching UFOs. It's okay to say that, right?
We need to make another video where we talk about the alien thing.
Yeah. And on top of that, right, we have not the Navy, and now the Army is working openly with public organizations talking about researching and investigating not only paranormal, but unidentified flying objects slash, you know, aerial phenomena is the new,
Right.
because UFO has a negative connotation, right?
Right. It's like
But
that.
it, you know, we're living in this age
Yeah.
where science and technology are allowing us to capture things that have only ever been reported by people and dismissed because they were only ever reported by people, which
Right.
is
Right.
absolutely fascinating to me.
It is. I would love to have more of these conversations with you because I'd also like to talk about near death experience and um
Which
yeah,
I've had.
yeah, I have not, but I'm fascinated with that too. And I went through a phase where I listened and I read a lot of near death experiences. There's a website, I can't remember what it's called, but this woman, have you heard of Anita Moorjani? She wrote a book called Die
No.
to Be Me. So she wrote a book, she wrote a Hay House book. Wayne Dyer actually found out about her. She had this amazing experience where she essentially died of cancer, and she explains in her book the whole experience of dying of cancer and coming back from her near-death experience. It's fascinating, and there's actually all medical proof because she was in the hospital and her organs all shut down, so it's, you know, it's, there's complete proof that she died, you know. And she wrote a series of books. That's the first book she wrote, but she started out by writing her story on this forum that actually was the same forum that I'd been reading a few years ago. I didn't read her story, but I read, there's thousands and thousands of people's near-death experience stories out there. Just like you
Yeah.
can find forums on ghost experiences. I wrote my ghost experiences and I shared them. But you read enough of that stuff and you like can't help but believe it. It's like the Sasquatch thing. Like I thought that I was like, oh, come on. And then I started listening. My husband's like, listen to this Sasquatch Chronicle thing. And I listened to like 10 of them and I'm like, okay, like I kind of believe this now.
It's
Like
such, that whole list of topics, the
fast.
11 paranormal, it's so fascinating, and it's really interesting when you dig into them. I'm really excited. I don't know if if you've heard, but
Yes.
Lisa and Danny are doing a VR to you tomorrow over on the Through Gut Readers
Amethyst
channel.
Ascension. Yeah, she's the one who started that tag, Amethyst Ascension. But yeah, like I'm excited to have more longer conversations like this about, because I don't think Reincarnation was Reincarnation on, I think maybe is it on
There was there was something about past lives on there, because
there?
that's what sparked me gliding you, because I was like, oh, I just watched your 11 paranormal video and you talked about this, and that was super cool.
Right.
And
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So before we go though, I'd like you to share that tarot deck you showed me, because that
oh,
is
the tarot. So I have this deck. It's called
I was hoping you'd do a little reading for me about my past life.
oh, I don't like
And
I haven't worked
you
with it
don't have
enough
to, no pressure. Maybe I can get you
to
to do
do that, but that could be another video. I haven't made it through the book all the way yet, actually, and I do want to read this book. It's called Art History Tarot for Past Lives. It's published by Red Orchid Publishing, which is an independent deck creator. I can't remember her
out of
name
print.
now because I'm a terrible human being.
No, you're not. Is it out of print? I
Hold
just
on.
I'm a terrible human being. I just put you on the spot. But is it out of print? Because maybe I need to look into getting that deck.
Her first name's Melanie, but if you go to redorchidpublishing.com,
Put that
it
down.
has all of that stuff. But she basically took the tarot and she broke it down. Here we go. She broke it down into location, like archetypal things when you're talking about life, past lives. So
Right.
locations, it's all done with art history. So it's locations, time periods, and then like archetypical people within your life, right? Mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, teachers, mentors, things like that, right? And so like the major arcana goes through like different things, right? Like the Empress is mother, right? And the thing on the cards is it has the traditional tarot. So you could use it as a traditional tarot deck. It
Right.
has the traditional tarot name at the bottom. At the top, it has the key number and the archetype or the location, right? So the Magician is Africa, the part that, you know, the whole idea of the origins and manifestation of humanity. The Emperor is father, right? The Hierophant is religion, which is really interesting. You know, when you get into like the minor arcana, the Five of Cups is loss.
Oh, this is so cool. I think I want this
Yeah.
deck.
It's a really interesting, you know, the Three of Wands is the High Middle Ages. It's this like,
Oh, okay. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I think I want that because I've been looking for a past life deck. I think there was like a, not Colette Baron Reed, maybe it was Colette Baron Reed or somebody like that who had done like a
Yeah.
life oracle deck. But I've been looking for one, so.
Yeah. This is the Page of Wands, which is Sun. Right?
Oh,
So
that's
it's
cool.
cool. Like the idea is right. Like you lay it out in a spread, and then you look at like things like obviously you'll have time periods and people and things like that that show up in the spread, and you can kind of then divine out a past life and look into like
That's
there's
cool.
even this card hit me and I don't even know why, but it's the Five of Pentacles and it's starvation.
Wow.
Like there's this very interesting, and like the keywords are pretty cool. The Eight of Pentacles is Greece, right? Like
There's got to be a
you don't,
German.
it's every card kind of has an association.
I think I have to get this deck.
Yeah, it's really
Reincarnation
cool.
is a huge
So
part of my belief
it's
system.
definitely worth checking out, and it's very inclusive. It has representations of every time period, of every like massive culture. They have like obviously it's not like Cherokee, right? But the
Right.
Pinnacle Court is indigenous people, so it's like
Okay.
indigenous father, indigenous mother, things like that.
Right.
So she did a really good job
Hmm.
of breaking it down into a usable thing. And then the book is really cool. She talks about like when you're looking at a card, like what's your favorite tarot card? Quick,
That's
go.
my favorite, High Priestess.
High Priestess. Okay, so
That's the first one that came to mind. I could have said.
that card is before Christ in this deck, right?
Mhm.
And so she gives you in the book, she gives you the traditional card name, which is the High Priestess. The root energy is female magic, passive and wise observation, female authority, psychic abilities. And then there's a section that says in a past life. This card refers to a period before Christ, primarily during the earth-centered religious practices. And then it has an alternative interpretation, which is if this card is not read as a time card, it could denote psychic abilities in a past life. A woman is wise and slow to act as she observes the events unfolding before her, or worshiping a goddess. Your past likely included nature-centered life without the restrictions of formal religion.
I think you
And
just
then
did
she
my
gives
reading
you like
for
the
me.
time period, and then there's a whole paragraph about
Yeah.
the art, which is really cool.
I think I need this deck. I think you just did the reading that I wanted to, because that.
Hashtag Dustin made you do it.
Yeah. Tell my husband.
Yeah, it's a really really cool deck. I've only worked with it a very little bit. I do need to
I've been looking for a deck like that
text
though.
review.
No, I've
So
been looking for a deck like that for a long time. So
yeah, it's amazing. My only gripe, like I told you, is the backs.
yeah, they
The
kind
backs are like her like overarching business theme.
of
I
right.
don't feel like they go with the fronts.
They
So
kind
I would
of
love to see her redo the backs.
like
So if you're
80s,
watching this,
yeah, wallpaper from the 80s or
maybe
something.
I've actually thought about. I've never rebacked a deck before. I might reback this one.
Yeah, it doesn't fit with the theme. And like I said, it reminds me of like my friend's mom's house in the
Yeah.
80s with like a picture she had or something. Like it reminds me of that.
So
Maybe the
cool.
80s is when.
Well, if you've had a past life experience or you have thoughts and opinions on past lives, you should comment down below and let
Yeah.
us know what you think.
Yes.
Or if you do a VR, make sure you tag us.
Yes, please. And I will do a follow up. I will do at some point when I get the guts and the courage up to do it. I'm going to do it.
Do you ever do one about the Egyptian door? I want to hear about that because
I
that's
have to. Those 2 lifetimes, I have to. I'm getting like again sweaty palms, but I have to because they've come up for me in like really in your face kind of ways. So I feel like I have to examine them, but I'm not gonna lie.
And there's so much about past lives we didn't talk about, like the connection to phobias. We didn't talk about
A little
birthmarks.
bit, but because my
Yeah,
phobia. But yeah, I mean, we were gonna talk more about that in that video that we will link. Also,
I
the
think we're like an hour already though.
yeah, we'll stop, but we could probably talk about it again. But that video that we talked about, the UVM or the UVA one, UVM is in Burlington.
I'll show you how to link it in the cards.
Yeah, they talk about like deformities, like birth deformities, and like birth.
It's really cool. It's really well done. And if I remember, I'll either send you the link so you can post it in the description, or I'll just comment
Okay.
with Shakespearean stuff that I've been obsessed over lately because it's really fascinating.
That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. So, okay, we'll say goodbye for now, even though we could keep talking about.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching.